America's female serial killer. A long, cinematic true crime story inspired by real events. Florida, the late 1980s. The highways stretched endlessly beneath the blazing southern sun. Truck stops buzzed with diesel engines. Neon motel signs flickered through the darkness. Travelers came and went without a second thought. And somewhere along those lonely roads walked a woman carrying years of anger, pain, and desperation. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. Before America would know her name, before the headlines and courtroom drama, before she became one of the most infamous female serial killers in history, she was simply another lost soul trying to survive. But her story didn't begin in Florida. It began decades earlier, and it began with tragedy. A childhood filled with darkness. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Michigan. From the very beginning, life seemed stacked against her. Her father was a violent man with a criminal past. He left the family before Aileen was old enough to remember him. Her mother abandoned Aileen and her brother shortly afterward. The children were eventually raised by their grandparents. But home was far from peaceful. The environment was harsh, unstable, and often abusive. Neighbors would later remember Aileen as a troubled child, angry, defiant, always fighting. As she grew older, she became increasingly isolated. The pain inside her never seemed to go away. Instead, it grew, year after year. By her early teens, Aileen was already surviving on her own, sleeping wherever she could, living in abandoned buildings, trading favors for food and shelter. The streets became her teacher, and the lessons were brutal. By the time she reached adulthood, trust was something she barely understood. Survival was all that mattered, the drifter. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Aileen drifted across America. She traveled through different states, worked odd jobs, got arrested several times, spent nights in jail, moved from town to town. People who met her often described her as unpredictable. Some said she could be funny and friendly. Others described her as explosive and dangerous. She carried deep emotional scars, and those scars affected every part of her life. Eventually, she found herself in Florida. There she survived mainly through prostitution. The highways became her workplace. Truck stops became her hunting ground for customers. Every day was uncertain. Every night brought new risks. Some encounters were harmless. Others were terrifying. But Aileen continued because she believed she had no other option. Meeting Tyria Moore. In 1986, Aileen met a woman named Tyria Moore. For the first time in years, Aileen felt she had found someone who cared about her. The relationship quickly became serious. The two women spent nearly all their time together. Aileen became deeply attached to Tyria. Friends noticed how protective she was, almost obsessed. She desperately wanted stability. She desperately wanted love. But stability was hard to maintain. Money remained a constant problem. Arguments became common, bills piled up, pressure mounted, and somewhere during those difficult years, events began moving toward a deadly conclusion. The first murder, December 1989. A middle-aged businessman named Richard Mallory disappeared. Mallory had been traveling through Florida. Then suddenly he was gone. Weeks later, his body was discovered in a remote wooded area. He had been shot multiple times. Police immediately launched an investigation, but there were very few clues, no witnesses, no clear suspects. The case appeared destined to remain unsolved, at least for the moment, because Mallory would not be the last victim. Hash of bodies along the highway. Over the following months, more men disappeared, one after another. Their bodies were discovered in forests, swamps, and remote locations. Many had been shot. Most had been traveling alone. Investigators slowly began noticing a pattern. The victims often shared similar circumstances. Several appeared to have encountered a woman shortly before their deaths. But who was she, and why were these men dying? The victim count continued growing. Fear spread across Florida. Truck drivers exchanged warnings at rest stops. News reports fueled public anxiety. The possibility of a serial killer became increasingly difficult to ignore. The killer's routine. According to investigators, the pattern was disturbingly consistent. Aileen would meet men along highways or at truck stops. She would enter their vehicles. The two would drive away together. At some point, the encounter would turn deadly. The victim would be shot. His vehicle would often disappear. Personal belongings would be taken. The body would later be abandoned in an isolated location. Then the cycle would repeat. Each murder increased police pressure. Each investigation added new pieces to the puzzle. And eventually those pieces started forming a picture. The investigation intensifies. By mid-1990, detectives believed they were dealing with a serial killer. Task forces were formed. Evidence was shared across jurisdictions. Investigators worked around the clock. Then a major breakthrough arrived. Several stolen vehicles connected to victims were located. Witnesses described seeing a woman driving them. The descriptions pointed toward one person, Aileen Wuornos. For the first time, police had a real suspect. Now they needed proof. Closing in. As detectives gathered evidence, the net tightened around Aileen. Witness statements, pawnshop records, vehicle recoveries, forensic evidence. Every lead seemed to point in the same direction. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention toward Tyria Moore. They believed she might hold critical information. After extensive discussions with police, Moore agreed to cooperate. She made recorded phone calls to Aileen. During those conversations, detectives hoped Aileen would reveal something useful. The strategy worked, and soon the case against her became overwhelming. Chapter the arrest. January 1991. The manhunt finally ended. Police arrested Aileen Wuornos at a biker bar in Florida. The news exploded across America. Television stations interrupted programming. Newspapers rushed out special editions. The idea of a female serial killer fascinated the public. Most notorious serial killers had been men. Aileen challenged that perception. People wanted answers. How could this happen? Why did she do it? What kind of person becomes a serial killer? The nation watched closely as the legal battle began. Aileen's defense. At first, Aileen admitted to the shootings, but she insisted there was more to the story. She claimed every killing was self-defense. According to her account, the men had attacked or threatened her. She argued that she feared for her life, and she responded with deadly force. Her attorneys emphasized her traumatic childhood, years of abuse, years of homelessness, years of violence. They portrayed her as a deeply damaged woman who had spent her life fighting to survive. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued the evidence showed robbery and murder. Vehicles had been stolen, possessions had been taken, victims had been left behind in remote areas. This wasn't self-defense, they said. This was serial murder. The jury had to decide whom to believe. The trials. The courtroom became a media circus. Reporters filled every seat. Television crews waited outside. Experts debated the case non-stop. Witnesses described the victims. Detectives presented evidence. Psychologists analyzed Aileen's behavior. The proceedings lasted for months. When verdicts finally arrived, the outcome was devastating for the defense. Guilty, again and again. Multiple convictions followed, and eventually multiple death sentences. Aileen Wuornos would spend the remainder of her life on death row. Tasha, the woman behind the headlines. Years passed. Inside prison, Aileen became increasingly unpredictable. Some interviews showed a calm, reflective woman.